Thank you, everyone. I just want to start off by just having a quick couple of words about the definition of a green infrastructure. We have a lot of discussion about how we define green infrastructure, and quite often we talk about defining it in terms of the form of the space, whether it's parks, gardens, waterways. I think the most important thing in terms of understanding green infrastructure is about the concept of green infrastructure, about the way we think about the design, management and planning of green infrastructure. It's not about the individual spaces per se, it's about that interconnectedness, interlinkages between those spaces and some of the green interventions in the built form, things like green roofs and green walls. It's about how they interact and perform those functions rather than focusing too much on the specific typologies. So I'm going to talk a bit about the work that's been happening in London on green infrastructure. Starting off going back a few years in terms of where the sort of policies come from, but then to touch on where that policy is being turned into practice, perhaps not quite as quickly as some people would hope. So the first thing is London is a green city. There's a big debate about how green London is, but London's one of the greenest world cities in terms of the quantum of space. The quality of the space may be up for negotiation and argument, but in terms of the quantum of space, London is a remarkably green city. Huge amounts of public open space, huge amounts of parkland, and significant amount of gardens. About 25-30% of London's green space is garden space. And also quite a lot of agricultural land and other open space on the periphery of London. But this map just illustrates, this is actually the map of the green space available in London. A significant amount of green space, and that includes the blue space as well. In London Plan definition of green infrastructure, we include rivers, waterways and the blue infrastructure. And the reason for that is that the planning system in London has been reasonably robust in protecting the quantum of space. Land use planning, going right back to the 1940s, has ensured that we've protected London's parks and gardens. Now, clearly, over the years, you'll find examples of where that protection hasn't been applied perfectly. But by and large, we've been pretty good as a big city in protecting that quantum of space. And that policy framework has been in place right from the 1940s, or even before the 1940s, right through until the turn of this century. And if you look at those planning documents, the old County of London Plan and the various iterations up to the London Plan, you will find those policies which are about protecting greenbelt, metropolitan open land, protecting areas of nature conservation interest. And they've served us reasonably well over the years. And so we have a legacy of fantastic parks, places like the Royal Parks, but also lots of municipal parks and district parks all across London. And areas of more natural habitat, nature reserves, SSSIs, areas of chalk ground, downland and marshes across London, reasonably well protected over the years. But we've also got a lot of other space, which is green space, but arguably is just that, it's green space. And one of the things that we're thinking about now in the GLA and a lot of our partners is about how we make best use of that green space going forward. What does it actually do? What does it actually deliver? Lots and lots of this sort of space in London, municipal parks, and also lots and lots of amenity green space. Now, we're quite proud in the protection of amenity green space, but I'd ask the question, what does that space do? What's it for? It's the space between buildings, it's green, it's reasonably pleasant, but it doesn't actually do very much. So one of the things we're asking the question now is, what can we do with that space, which is about delivering green infrastructure functions? How do we actually ensure that space works for its living and delivers lots and lots of additional benefits, which justifies the case for investing and funding the management of that space? And one of the big drivers is the projected population growth in London. We're now at about 8.5 million people in London, which is back to the levels it was in the 1940s. London's already had a population of this size back in the 1940s, then it dipped in the decades subsequent. But we're now back up to that level of the 1940s, about 8.5 million people in London. But the current projection suggests that London's population could be 11 million, possibly even 13 million by 2030, 2040, and certainly by 2050. Those sort of higher projections are likely to be London's population. Significant increase in the population in London because of London, the attractiveness of London as a global city where people actually want to come and work and live and invest. And we've got to address that. We can't sort of shut the doors and tell people to go away. People are wanting to move to London. We've got to accommodate that growth. There's a debate earlier about growth, but the reality is at the moment, in the current political market system we operate in, these cities like London are growing. You need to be a very bold and brave politician to come up with a completely different approach to the growth and economy of the UK. So how do you accommodate that growth? How do you deal with that growth? How do you support that population whilst recognising some of the other constraints? And again, very few politicians would be brave enough to say we accommodate London's growth by expanding London outwards into the green belt. No politician is going to stand up and say that. The current political and policy framework is to accommodate London's growth within its boundaries, which has some quite profound implications for the development and the urban renewal of the city. And green infrastructure potentially has quite a significant role to play in that scenario. And we're also dealing with issues like, most of you will be aware of this, issues like climate change. And depending on the sort of current sort of political perspective, there are different views about what is causing climate change. But I think most people now accept that something's happening and we do have to plan for the potential for significant increase in flooding, significant increase in things like heat waves in London over the coming years. Whether it's anthropomorphic or whether it's part of a natural cycle, we need to plan for those scenarios because they have big implications for how we manage and develop our city. This is actually quite an illustrative picture. This is actually a note that went up in a shop in central London in 2003 or 2006, the major heat wave, where the shop closed. It closed because it was too hot. And you imagine that happening in central London, in a busy shopping period in central London where lots and lots of shops close because it's too hot, or lots and lots of shops have to invest in huge amounts of air conditioning to operate. And lots of the traders in central London, a lot of the big retail operators in central London are very, very worried about places like Westfield and so many other big out-of-town shopping centres which are air-conditioned. They're very fearful of the fact that actually footfall in London may decline quite substantially if the projections in terms of summer heat come about in the next few years. People will stop coming to central London to shop, which has a profound impact on the economy of central London. So people with a very, very strong commercial interest are starting to begin to address and identify and recognise these issues, things we need to deal with. So bearing in mind that sort of that context, the current version of the London Plan has tried to move policy on in terms of parks and green spaces, and has introduced policies around green infrastructure, urban greening, green roofs, sustainable drainage, begin to think about it's not just about protecting and preserving the quantum of green space, it's about what we do with that green space. How do we actually manage it? How do we design it? How do we deliver it in different ways that ensures we retain the amenity and recreation value of that space, but also delivers these other functions that we know it can deliver in terms of stormwater management, urban cooling, food growing, all those issues that most people in this audience are aware of. How do we actually make that happen? And London Plan's got supplementary documents. There's the All London Green Grid supplementary planning guidance, which starts to tease out some of those functions of the green infrastructure network, what it can actually deliver. And documents like the Sustainable Design and Construction SPD, which again identifies ways in which the built environment can be greener, things like green roofs and green walls. These documents don't provide prescriptions. The regional planning guidance can't be very prescriptive, but it gives people a route map towards thinking differently about the way we manage design spaces and also how we incorporate green infrastructure into the built environment. And that's actually having lots of knock-on effects now. Lots of things are beginning to happen. Particularly in central London, all the areas of urban renewal where there's major new development happening. In central London now we've got, there was a target set in 3 years ago to get 100,000 square metres of new green roof in London, central London, we had a sort of five-year target. We've now got 150,000 square metres. So the policy framework is actually delivering significant new green infrastructure where there's new development. Retrofit is a completely different story, but where there's new development, there's significant new green infrastructure being implemented on the back of commercial development, because there's quite a robust policy framework to drive that delivery. And these are the sorts of functions that we're trying to deliver by thinking differently about the management and design of green spaces and things like green roofs and green walls. As I said, things are happening. Things are changing. There is a change in the way we manage some of those spaces. Some very good examples in London of how we've restored rivers in parks, brought rivers back into the parks, not purely for ecological or amenity value, but because they actually provide flood management. So this is Chimbote Meadows. It's actually quite an old scheme back in the sort of 2000 and 2005, where a river in a concrete channel, put into a concrete channel in the 1950s, because that was deemed to be the way you managed flood in those days. Now broken out of channel, creating a much more aesthetically pleasing park, and the number of people visiting the park have now increased. But crucially, this project and a number of other similar projects along that river corridor have substantially reduced flood risk in Lewisham Town Centre. Lewisham Town Centre flooded on 3 or 4 occasions between the 1970s and the 1990s. And these schemes have substantially reduced flood risk in Lewisham Town Centre. And those who go to Lewisham now, Lewisham is one of the sort of major growth areas. Huge amount of commercial property, huge amounts of residential property, and these schemes are actually delivering that functional benefit of reduced flood risk. The trick at the moment is that this was funded by the Environment Agency and the public sector. The beneficiaries of this infrastructure, the developers and the people who own that commercial property, aren't paying for this green infrastructure. And there's an issue there about how we actually ensure that the beneficiaries are paying for some of this investment. And there's lots of schemes like this in London. Lots of parks in London have had their rivers restored to the park for a whole range of different reasons, different benefits. And on a smaller scale, we're implementing green infrastructure. Again, lots and lots of fantastic examples right across London, quite often hidden away because they're quite small-scale examples of small-scale green infrastructure interventions that are changing the notion of how we manage, design the public realm. This is a site in Bethnal Green, a piece of fairly redundant road. It didn't go anywhere, and the parking spaces weren't really needed anymore, and this parking was moved elsewhere. So a bit of redundant space next to the building on the left-hand side, which is a community centre, but a piece of space outside, it didn't really function very well. So partly through funding from the Mayor's Office, but also Tower Hamlets Council and others, we created this small community pocket park. And its primary function for the people who actually use this space, it actually becomes a civic space for the people who use that community centre. They create a space out of the community centre where they can have it as a civic space outdoors, run lots of events in there. But crucially, it's also a piece of green infrastructure. The planters and the planted area in the middle of this scheme is part of a small-scale SUDS network. And again, we're trying to inform and educate people about what that space does in terms of some of the signage and the information around that park, explain this is actually a piece of SUDS infrastructure. Again, a small-scale intervention, but these kind of interventions are happening all across London now because we're recognising that those streets and those bits of public realm can be used in very many different ways. And I think someone mentioned earlier about the sort of reduce in car use in major cities. Certainly in central London, the number of people owning cars is starting to decline, and therefore the need for car parking spaces is starting to decline. And some of the housing standards are already driving reduction in car parking spaces. But certainly, if you think about central London, the amount of space taken up by roads and streets, if you rethink what those roads and streets are for, you can suddenly identify lots of potential space to do some very interesting things around green infrastructure, because we won't need them as traditional streets in 20, 30, 40 years' time, probably. And then making sure that the other part of green infrastructure is about how we green the urban environment, green buildings. As I mentioned earlier, there's actually a significant increase in the number of green roofs in central London, a lot of it driven by dusty gedge and a sort of biodiversity component around creating habitat for wildlife, but increasingly being done also to address that issue of stormwater management. How do we actually reduce the burden on our Victorian network of stormwater drains? And green roofs are part of that solution. So again, a lot of these now happening on the back of renewal and refurbishment of urban London. And those ideas and concepts are starting to be writ large in some of the major regeneration projects in London. This is not a photograph. This is a picture. So there's always nice ways of manipulating pictures. But the Olympic Park has been designed as a big subsystem. When the River Lee was broken out for the Olympics to make it a much more attractive landscape for the Olympics, is also tied into a sustainable urban drainage network. And as the new development that occurs around the Olympic Park comes on stream, those new developments will have to have green roofs, suds and swales which link into that sustainable drainage network. So that policy framework is beginning to drive some quite significant changes in the way we design and manage new urban neighbourhoods in London. It's easier a place like this because you're starting with a relatively blank canvas. Much more difficult to retrofit this into existing built environment. But where the opportunities arise for new development, those policy frameworks are beginning to drive a significant change in the way we design and manage those landscapes, with green infrastructure underpinning some of the philosophy in terms of the development. And it's not just happening in London. It's happening across the world. This is New York, and New York, as Chado pointed out, hit with a number of quite significant environmental calamities, Hurricane Sandy, drought, which really woke New York up to the need to think differently about how they design and manage their city. And also a very tough regulatory framework in terms of water quality. One of the big drivers in the US in terms of green infrastructure is water quality regulation. And that's a federal requirement to significantly improve water quality. We don't quite have the same strong regulatory regime here in the UK which drives that. But I would say that in New York, the impacts in New York were significant, and we haven't yet experienced significant climatic impacts in London. And that's one of the issues that we do need to recognise, is that it's driven by politics and public policy. Because we haven't had a severe impact, although we recognise it may well be down the line, it's not something which is at the forefront of the public's minds, and therefore it's not at the forefront of politicians' minds, because politicians are barometers of public opinion. It's not something that's really taken hold here at the moment, because we haven't suffered a significant climatic impact. It may well come, but it's one of those sort of terrible dilemmas where you think, actually, wouldn't it be good if? It really brings it to people's attention, but because we haven't had that, it's not really become it's not top of the political agenda. But one of the things that is beginning to sort of change the way we think is that thinking about London's infrastructure needs. That issue about London's population increase has driven a whole debate about how do we actually think about a future London. What are the infrastructure requirements of a future London of 11, 13 million people? Significant new investment in transport infrastructure to deal with that number of people. So the London Infrastructure Plan's been produced, which tries to tease out some of those issues. If you read the London Infrastructure Plan, as Chelo mentioned, green infrastructure is in there. You might think it's not in there enough, but I think the most important thing is that it's in there. There's a chapter on green infrastructure, which is actually a huge step forward in terms of thinking about infrastructure planning. The fact that in a document of this importance, setting the agenda for London's agenda for the next 50 years, saying we need to invest in transport, digital networks, water supplies, energy networks, we also need to invest in green infrastructure. To me, that's quite a big step forward in terms of political acceptance of that agenda. That won't result in huge investment in green infrastructure next year, the year after. It might take 5-10 years for that thing to actually begin to influence significant investment decisions, but having it in there at this point is politically incredibly important, and will start to change the way we think about the future investment in infrastructure to ensure that green infrastructure complements the other infrastructure investments we need to make in London in the years ahead. That's me. Hopefully I've kept to time. And I'll be here the rest of the afternoon on the panel to answer questions. Thank you very much.